Marcus Chen adjusted the worn strap of his daughter's backpack as they approached the boarding gate, the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like an old jacket. 80-year-old Emma bounced beside him, her dark eyes wide with excitement as she pressed her face against the terminal windows to watch the plane's taxi across the tarmac. The morning sun cast long shadows through the glass, illuminating the controlled chaos of Chicago O'Hare Airport. Marcus checked their boarding passes for the third time, a habit born from years of double-checking everything when you're the only parent left to get things right. Flight 847 to Denver, seats 9A and 9B. Nothing fancy, but it would get them to Emma's grandmother safely. "Daddy, look how big that one is," Emma whispered, pointing at a massive aircraft being pushed back from the gate. Her small finger traced the outline of the wings against the glass, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with a familiar mixture of pride and protectiveness. He knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he straightened her collar. "That's a wide-body, sweetheart. Probably heading somewhere far away, maybe across the ocean." The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, and Marcus gathered their modest carry-on bags. His orange safety vest from his morning shift at the airport hung visible beneath his jacket, drawing a few dismissive glances from the business travelers around them. He was used to being invisible, just another worker bee in the vast hive of aviation. "Daddy, why do the airplane engines sound different?" Emma asked as they joined the boarding line. Her question caught him off guard, the way her innocent observations often did. Most people heard generic airplane noise, but Emma had inherited his ear for the subtle variations in mechanical sounds. "Well, each engine has its own personality," Marcus explained quietly, his voice carrying the patience that came from answering 1,000 questions from a curious child. "Some purr like big cats, others rumble like thunder. You just have to listen carefully." The flight attendant at the gate barely glanced at their boarding passes, her practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes as she waved them through. Marcus had learned not to take it personally. In his ground crew uniform and with calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, he understood exactly what people saw when they looked at him. As they walked down the jet bridge, Emma's excitement bubbled over. "Are we really going to fly above the clouds, Daddy? Will we be able to see angels?" Marcus chuckled, the sound warm in the enclosed space of the boarding tunnel. "We might see something even better, Em. We might see the world from a completely different perspective." The aircraft stretched before them, a marvel of engineering that never failed to stir something deep in Marcus's chest. Even after years of working around planes, loading baggage and fueling aircraft, he still felt a reverence for these machines that defied gravity with such elegant precision. Their seats were toward the back of the plane, in the section where families with children and budget-conscious travelers typically found themselves. Marcus helped Emma stow her backpack in the overhead compartment, noting the slight vibration in the aircraft structure that spoke of engines warming up on the tarmac below. "Excuse me, sir, you'll need to keep moving," said a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag reading Sarah. Her tone carried the barely concealed impatience of someone dealing with what she perceived as inexperienced passengers. "We have other people boarding behind you." "Of course, sorry," Marcus replied mildly, guiding Emma to their row. He'd heard that tone countless times before, the subtle dismissal that came with being perceived as just another working-class passenger who didn't understand the rhythms of air travel. Emma settled into the window seat, immediately pressing her face against the small portal to watch the ground crew preparing the aircraft. Marcus took the aisle seat, his trained eyes automatically scanning the cabin layout, noting emergency exits and safety equipment locations. Old habits died hard, especially ones drilled into you during military service. The plane continued to fill with passengers, a diverse mix of business travelers, families, and individuals all bound for Denver. Marcus watched the controlled ballet of people finding their seats, stowing luggage, and settling in for the journey ahead. In a few hours, they would all be just another successful flight statistic, assuming everything went according to plan. As the boarding process continued, Marcus found himself listening to the subtle sounds of the aircraft around them. The auxiliary power unit hummed steadily, providing electricity and compressed air while the plane sat at the gate. The cargo doors closed with their distinctive metallic thunks, and he could hear the rhythmic chatter of the baggage crew finishing their work below. "Daddy, what's that sound?" Emma asked, her head tilted as she listened to a particular mechanical rhythm coming from somewhere beneath their feet. Marcus paused, his own ears tuning in to isolate the sound she'd noticed. It was the hydraulic system cycling, a normal operational sound that most passengers would never consciously hear. But Emma had always been remarkably perceptive about her environment, a trait that both impressed and worried him. "That's just the airplane getting ready to fly, sweetheart," he said softly. "All these sounds mean the plane is healthy and ready to take us safely to Grandma's house." Where in the world are you right now as you listen to this story? Whether you're hearing this during your morning commute, relaxing at home in the evening, or maybe even on your own flight somewhere, we'd love to know where our story is reaching you today. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and reassuring as he welcomed passengers aboard and announced their expected flight time to Denver. Marcus automatically processed the information, comparing it against his own knowledge of typical routing and weather patterns for this time of day. Everything sounded routine, exactly the kind of uneventful flight that every passenger hoped for and every aviation professional worked to provide. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of movement that had once been as natural to him as breathing. The gentle rocking motion brought back memories he usually kept carefully locked away, memories of a different life when he wore a different uniform and carried different responsibilities. Emma pressed her nose against the window, watching the terminal buildings slowly drift past as the tug pushed their aircraft toward the taxiway. "Daddy, how do they know where to go?" she asked, her breath fogging the small portal. "There are special roads for airplanes, just like cars have highways," Marcus explained, though his mind was elsewhere, drifting back to a time when he could have given her a much more detailed explanation about ground control frequencies, taxi clearances, and the intricate dance of aircraft movement at major airports. 5 years ago, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had been one of the Air Force's most skilled flight engineers, specializing in the complex systems that kept military transport aircraft operational in challenging conditions. He had served 3 tours overseas, troubleshooting everything from hydraulic failures at 30,000 feet to emergency landings on damaged runways. His call sign had been Compass, earned during his second deployment when he successfully guided a crippled C-130 through a sandstorm using nothing but backup instruments and his encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now spent his days loading baggage into the cargo holds of the same types of aircraft he once helped keep airborne in combat zones. But that was before the accident, before the injury that ended his military career, before Emma's mother decided that being married to a disabled veteran with an uncertain future wasn't part of her life plan. "Why did you leave the Air Force, Daddy?" Emma had asked him once, with the directness that only children possess. He had told her the simple version, that he got hurt and couldn't do that job anymore. He hadn't explained about the shrapnel that damaged his left leg during a mortar attack on their base, or about the months of physical therapy, or about the medical discharge that came with condolences and a small disability pension. The engines began to spool up as they reached the runway, their distinctive whine building to the crescendo that preceded takeoff. Marcus automatically identified the sound signature, his trained ear cataloging the healthy rhythm of the turbofan engines. Everything sounded normal, routine, exactly as it should for a commercial flight on a clear morning. "Are you nervous, Daddy?" Emma asked, noticing how intently he was listening to the aircraft around them. "Not nervous, sweetheart. Just paying attention," Marcus replied, forcing himself to relax. "It's like when you listen to your favorite song. You know all the parts, so you notice if something sounds different." Emma nodded solemnly, accepting his explanation with the trust that children reserve for their parents. She had never known him as anything other than the man who worked at the airport, who came home tired and smelling of jet fuel, who made her breakfast every morning and helped with homework every night. In her world, he had always been exactly who he was now. The financial reality of single parenthood had forced difficult choices. The disability pension barely covered their modest apartment, and jobs that accommodated his physical limitations were scarce. When the position at the airport became available, Marcus had swallowed his pride and taken it, grateful for steady work that kept him close to the aviation world he still loved, even if he could no longer be fully part of it. His co-workers were good people, hard-working men and women who loaded bags and fueled planes with the same dedication he brought to the job. They knew he had military experience, but most assumed he had been in some generic support role. It was easier to let them think that than to explain about flight systems and emergency procedures that seemed like ancient history now. "Daddy, will Grandma be happy to see us?" Emma asked as the plane accelerated down the runway. "She'll be thrilled, Em. She's been counting the days since we planned this trip," Marcus assured her, grateful for the change of subject. His mother-in-law, Emma's grandmother, had remained close to them even after the divorce. She understood that Emma needed stable relationships, needed to know that some adults in her life wouldn't disappear when things got difficult. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing steadily into the morning sky over Chicago. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of wheels retracting into their wells, heard the subtle change in engine note as the pilots adjusted power settings for their climb. Every sound was a paragraph in a technical manual he had once memorized, every vibration a sentence in the language of flight that he still spoke fluently, even if no one asked him to translate anymore. Emma giggled with delight as the ground fell away beneath them, the cars and buildings shrinking to toy-like proportions. "We're really flying, Daddy. We're like birds." "Yes, we are," Marcus agreed, watching his daughter's wonder and feeling a familiar ache in his chest. She deserved so much more than their small life, deserved opportunities and experiences that seemed increasingly out of reach on his airport wages. But she never complained, never asked for things they couldn't afford, never made him feel inadequate for being unable to provide the life he wanted to give her. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and Marcus found himself automatically noting the locations of life vests and oxygen masks, cataloging emergency procedures that were second nature to him. It was an unconscious habit, the way his mind still processed aircraft safety even when he was just another passenger in seat 9A. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude with the smooth efficiency that characterized modern commercial aviation. Outside the small window, the landscape below had transformed into a patchwork quilt of fields and highways, all rendered miniature by their elevation of 35,000 feet. Emma had settled into her seat with a coloring book, occasionally glancing up to watch the clouds drift past like cotton balls scattered across an endless blue canvas. Marcus tried to relax, but something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but his trained senses detected a slight irregularity in the engine rhythm. The variation was so minor that it fell well within normal operational parameters, yet something about the frequency pattern felt off to his experienced ear. He shifted in his seat, trying to dismiss the concern as an occupational hazard of knowing too much about aircraft systems. After years of troubleshooting military transport planes under combat conditions, he had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to mechanical variations. It was a skill that had saved lives in Afghanistan, but here on a routine commercial flight, it felt more like a burden. The flight attendant named Sarah passed by their row, checking on passengers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these duties thousands of times. Her gaze barely registered Marcus and Emma, dismissing them as typical economy passengers who required minimal attention. She paused briefly to help a businessman in first class adjust his seat, her demeanor noticeably warmer when dealing with passengers who fit her expectations of importance. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly as she passed their row again. "I was wondering if you could check on something for me." Sarah stopped, her expression already showing signs of impatience before he had even finished speaking. "Yes, what is it?" "I'm hearing a slight variation in the port engine sound." "It's probably nothing, but it might be worth having the crew take a look," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. He had learned to phrase technical concerns diplomatically, knowing that unsolicited advice from passengers was rarely welcomed. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, and Marcus could see her mentally cataloging him as one of those nervous passengers who imagine problems where none existed. "Sir, I can assure you that our pilots are highly trained professionals who monitor all aircraft systems continuously. If there were any issues with the engines, they would be the first to know." I understand that completely, Marcus replied patiently. I'm just mentioning it because I have some experience with aircraft engines, and the harmonic frequency seems slightly off from what I would normally expect. The flight attendant's expression shifted from mild annoyance to barely concealed condescension. She glanced at his visible airport ground crew identification badge and seemed to reach an immediate conclusion about his qualifications to assess aircraft performance. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but loading baggage doesn't really qualify someone to diagnose engine problems, Sarah said with a smile that failed to mask the dismissal in her tone. Our maintenance crews perform extensive pre-flight inspections, and our pilots receive constant data from sophisticated monitoring systems. I think you can rest assured that everything is functioning normally. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from anger but from the familiar sting of being reduced to his current job title. He had encountered this attitude countless times since leaving the military, the assumption that his current employment defined the entirety of his knowledge and experience. It was easier to let people think what they wanted than to explain credentials that seemed increasingly irrelevant to his daily reality. Of course, you're absolutely right, Marcus said quietly, settling back into his seat. I'm sure it's nothing. Emma looked up from her coloring book, sensing the tension in the brief exchange. Her dark eyes moved between her father and the flight attendant with the perceptive awareness that children often possess about adult dynamics they don't fully understand. Is everything okay, Daddy? She whispered after Sarah had moved on to attend to other passengers. Everything's fine, sweetheart, Marcus assured her, forcing a smile. Just Daddy being too careful, like always. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus continued to monitor the subtle variations in engine sound that had caught his attention. The irregularity was still there, a barely detectable change in the harmonic pattern that suggested possible issues with fan blade alignment or bearing wear. In a military context, such symptoms would warrant immediate investigation, but commercial aviation operated under different risk tolerances and maintenance schedules. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude and expected arrival time in Denver. His tone was calm and professional, giving no indication that the flight crew was aware of any mechanical concerns. Marcus found himself analyzing the pilot's speech patterns, listening for any subtle stress indicators that might suggest awareness of developing problems. Emma returned to her coloring, occasionally pointing out the window to identify cloud formations or distant landmarks. Her innocent chatter provided a welcome distraction from Marcus's growing unease about the engine irregularities he continued to detect. He forced himself to focus on her questions and observations, reminding himself that his hypervigilance was probably unnecessary in this controlled commercial environment. The aircraft encountered a patch of light turbulence, nothing more than the routine atmospheric disturbances that characterized flight at high altitude. But Marcus noticed that the engine sound variation seemed to become slightly more pronounced during the turbulent period, suggesting that whatever was causing the irregularity might be responsive to changes in aircraft loading or orientation. He glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers seemed completely unaware of anything unusual. The businessman in first class was absorbed in his laptop, a family across the aisle was watching a movie together, and an elderly woman 2 rows ahead was peacefully napping. Their collective calm reinforced the likelihood that his concerns were unfounded, products of professional paranoia rather than legitimate mechanical issues. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right with their aircraft, a sensation that years of military aviation experience had taught him never to ignore completely. 20 minutes into the flight, the first noticeable vibration rippled through the aircraft cabin. It was subtle at first, nothing more than a gentle tremor that most passengers might attribute to normal atmospheric turbulence. But Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the distinctive pattern of mechanical vibration rather than aerodynamic disturbance. Emma looked up from her coloring book, her crayon pausing mid-stroke as she felt the slight shaking in her seat. "Daddy, what was that?" "Just a little bumpy air, Marcus said softly, though his trained senses were already cataloging the vibration frequency and duration. The tremor had lasted approximately 3 seconds and seemed to originate from the left side of the aircraft, consistent with his earlier concerns about the port engine irregularities. The turbulence became more pronounced as they continued westward, but Marcus could distinguish between the random buffeting of atmospheric disturbance and the rhythmic patterns that suggested mechanical issues. His military experience had taught him to read these subtle differences like a diagnostic manual written in vibration and sound. A flight attendant walked past their section, her practiced smile reassuring passengers who seemed concerned about the increased motion. Most travelers accepted the explanation that they were experiencing routine turbulence, but Marcus noticed that the crew member's eyes held a hint of uncertainty that suggested she might be sensing something unusual as well. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the familiar voice over the intercom. "We're experiencing some light to moderate turbulence as we cross a weather front. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. We expect to be through this rough air in about 10 to 15 minutes. The announcement seemed to satisfy most passengers, but Marcus detected something in the pilot's tone that concerned him. There was a slight tension in the captain's voice, a barely perceptible stress that suggested the flight crew might be dealing with more than routine atmospheric conditions. Emma had abandoned her coloring entirely now, gripping Marcus's arm as another vibration shuddered through the aircraft. This one was stronger, more sustained, and accompanied by a subtle change in engine pitch that confirmed Marcus's worst suspicions about developing mechanical problems. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Marcus whispered, wrapping his arm around Emma's shoulders. "Sometimes airplanes have to work a little harder when they fly through bumpy weather." But even as he comforted his daughter, Marcus's mind was racing through possible scenarios based on the symptoms he was observing. The vibration pattern suggested potential issues with fan blade balance or bearing alignment in the port engine. Such problems could escalate quickly under the stress of continued operation, potentially leading to more serious mechanical failures. The aircraft banked slightly to the left, and Marcus felt another distinctive vibration that seemed to resonate through the entire airframe. Several passengers gasped audibly, and he heard nervous laughter from the seats behind them as people tried to reassure themselves that everything was normal. Flight attendant Sarah appeared in the aisle again, moving with practiced efficiency, but Marcus noticed that her movements seemed more purposeful now, less routine than her earlier passes through the cabin. She paused to speak quietly with a passenger in first class, her voice too low for Marcus to hear but her body language suggesting she was addressing specific concerns rather than providing generic reassurance. "Daddy, I don't like this," Emma whispered, pressing closer to his side. Her small hand found his, and Marcus felt the tremor of fear in her grip. "I know, baby. But remember what we talked about before? Sometimes things that seem scary are just different from what we're used to," Marcus said, drawing on every parenting skill he had developed to keep his voice calm and steady. "The pilots are very good at their jobs, and they know exactly how to handle situations like this." Another vibration shook the aircraft, this one accompanied by a subtle but unmistakable change in the engine sound that made Marcus's blood run cold. The harmonic frequency had shifted in a way that suggested significant mechanical stress, possibly indicating imminent component failure in the port engine assembly. He found himself automatically calculating flight parameters based on their current position and altitude. They were approximately 40 minutes from Denver, flying over terrain that offered limited emergency landing options. If the engine problems escalated to the point of requiring emergency procedures, the crew would need to make critical decisions about diversion airports and approach strategies. The passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman who had been confidently working on his laptop throughout the flight, finally looked up with concern as another sustained vibration rolled through the cabin. His expression reflected the growing unease that Marcus could see spreading among the more observant passengers. A child several rows ahead began crying, triggering a sympathetic response from Emma, who looked up at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" "Yes, Em. We're going to be perfectly fine," Marcus said with conviction he hoped she couldn't tell he didn't entirely feel. "And you know what? When we get to Grandma's house, we'll have quite an adventure story to tell her about our bumpy airplane ride." The aircraft lurched slightly to one side, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of engine power being adjusted as the pilots worked to maintain stable flight. His experienced ear detected the subtle variations in thrust settings that suggested the crew was beginning to compensate for developing asymmetric power conditions. Sarah appeared at their row again, this time moving with obvious urgency despite her attempts to maintain a calm demeanor. "Sir, I need you to make sure your daughter's seatbelt is tight and that any loose items are secured," she said to Marcus, her professional mask beginning to slip slightly. "Of course," Marcus replied, checking Emma's seatbelt while studying the flight attendant's expression for additional clues about the severity of their situation. "Is there anything else we should know?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, and in that brief pause Marcus saw confirmation of his growing fears that they were dealing with more than routine turbulence. The emergency began with a sound that Marcus recognized instantly but hoped he would never hear again. A sharp metallic grinding echoed through the cabin, followed by a violent shudder that sent overhead compartments rattling and passengers crying out in alarm. The port engine was failing catastrophically, and Marcus knew they had perhaps minutes before complete power loss on that side. Emma's scream joined the chorus of frightened voices as the aircraft lurched dramatically to the left. Marcus pulled her close, his military training automatically taking over as he assessed their situation with the cold clarity that had once kept his crew alive in combat zones. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," came the voice over the intercom, no longer calm but urgently professional. "We are experiencing a mechanical issue with one of our engines. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work to resolve this situation." The cabin erupted in nervous chatter and barely suppressed panic. Several passengers were crying openly now, and Marcus could hear frantic phone calls being attempted despite the altitude making cellular connection impossible. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, but their own tension was evident in their quick, sharp movements. "Daddy, what's happening?" Emma sobbed against his chest, her small body shaking with fear. "The airplane is having some trouble with one of its engines, baby," Marcus said quietly, stroking her hair while his eyes tracked the movements of the crew. "But airplanes are built to fly safely even when one engine isn't working properly. The pilots know exactly what to do." His words were true but incomplete. While commercial aircraft were indeed designed to operate on a single engine, the violent nature of this failure suggested possible cascading problems that could complicate emergency procedures. The grinding sound he had heard indicated potential turbine blade separation, which could cause debris damage to other critical systems. Another violent shudder shook the aircraft, and Marcus felt the unmistakable sensation of rapid altitude loss. The pilots were beginning emergency descent procedures, likely preparing for a diversion to the nearest suitable airport. He mentally calculated their position and estimated they were probably still too far from Denver to attempt landing there under emergency conditions. Flight attendant Sarah appeared in the aisle near their section, her earlier condescension replaced by obvious stress as she worked to reassure passengers. When she reached their row, Marcus caught her attention with a gentle but firm voice. "Excuse me, I know this isn't the time for second-guessing, but based on what I'm hearing, you might want to prepare for a possible emergency landing," Marcus said quietly, pitching his voice low enough that Emma couldn't hear clearly over the ambient noise. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time she really looked at Marcus rather than dismissing him. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I need you to focus on keeping yourself and your daughter calm while we handle the situation." "I understand, and I'm not trying to interfere," Marcus replied patiently. "But I have extensive experience with aircraft emergencies, and the sound patterns I'm hearing suggest this could escalate quickly. Your crew might benefit from knowing that Passenger 9A has relevant technical knowledge if needed." Before Sarah could respond, another violent vibration rocked the aircraft, this one accompanied by a visible flash of light outside the windows that confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The port engine was experiencing uncontained failure, meaning debris was likely breaching the engine casing and potentially damaging surrounding aircraft systems. The cabin lights flickered momentarily, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of backup electrical systems activating. Several passengers screamed as the aircraft banked sharply to the right, the pilots fighting to maintain control with asymmetric thrust and possible hydraulic damage. "Daddy, I'm scared," Emma whispered, her face buried against his shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. But remember how brave you were when you had to get that shot at the doctor's office. You were scared then too, but you did exactly what you needed to do," Marcus said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Right now, we just need to sit tight and let the pilots do their job. Can you help Daddy by being brave like that again?" Emma nodded against his chest, her trembling beginning to subside slightly as she drew strength from his calm presence. Marcus continued stroking her hair while his trained senses catalogued every sound and vibration, building a mental picture of their aircraft's deteriorating condition. The captain's voice returned to the intercom, and this time the stress was unmistakable. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible emergency landing. Passengers, please review the safety information in your seat pockets and listen carefully to crew instructions. As you listen to this moment of crisis, we wonder what thoughts are going through your mind. Are you thinking about your own family, your own moments of having to be brave when everything felt uncertain? Sometimes the most ordinary people find extraordinary strength when the people they love need them most." The aircraft continued its emergency descent, and Marcus could feel the pilots working to maintain control as various warning systems activated throughout the cockpit. His years of flight engineering experience told him they were dealing with multiple cascading failures, the kind of emergency scenario that tested every aspect of crew training and aircraft design. Sarah hurried past their row again, this time carrying emergency equipment and speaking rapidly into her headset. Marcus noticed that her earlier dismissive attitude had been replaced by focused professionalism as the reality of their situation became undeniable. The grinding noise from the damaged engines suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that Marcus knew meant complete power loss on the port side. They were now flying on a single engine with unknown damage to other critical systems, racing against time to reach an airport capable of handling their emergency. The silence from the dead engine was somehow more terrifying than the grinding noise had been. Marcus felt the aircraft struggle to maintain stable flight as the pilots worked with reduced power and compromised control systems. The emergency descent continued, but he could sense the crew's growing difficulty in managing the aircraft's deteriorating condition. Through the small window beside Emma's seat, Marcus could see they were descending through scattered cloud layers, the ground becoming more visible as they lost altitude. His mental calculation suggested they were probably diverting to Colorado Springs or possibly attempting to reach Denver despite the distance, depending on which airport the crew judged most suitable for their emergency approach. "Daddy, why did it get so quiet?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened as she noticed the absence of the familiar engine noise. "One of the engines stopped working, but that's okay because airplanes have two engines for exactly this reason," Marcus explained gently, though he knew the situation was far more complex than his simplified explanation suggested. "It's like having two legs. If you hurt one, you can still walk with the other one." The analogy seemed to comfort Emma slightly, though Marcus could feel her tension in the way she gripped his hand. Around them, other passengers were displaying various stages of fear and anxiety, from quiet prayer to barely controlled panic. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing for emergency landing procedures while trying to maintain calm among the increasingly frightened travelers. Marcus found himself studying the crew's movements and communications, his trained eye picking up subtle indicators of the challenges they were facing. The way Sarah checked and rechecked emergency equipment suggested they were preparing for the possibility of evacuation procedures. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by the focused intensity of someone dealing with a genuine crisis. The aircraft lurched suddenly to one side, and Marcus felt the unmistakable sensation of the pilots fighting to maintain control. The asymmetric thrust from having only one functioning engine was creating handling difficulties that required constant attention and adjustment. He could hear the remaining engine working harder, its pitch higher as it struggled to provide sufficient power for their continued flight. "Flight attendants, please take your seats for landing," came the captain's voice over the intercom, though Marcus noted they were still at too high an altitude for normal approach procedures. The announcement meant they were approaching their diversion airport and beginning emergency approach protocols. A new sound caught Marcus's attention, a hydraulic whining that suggested possible damage to the aircraft's flight control systems. This was the complication he had feared, the cascading effect of engine debris potentially damaging other critical components. If they had lost primary hydraulic systems, the pilots would be dealing with severely compromised control authority. Emma noticed the change in his expression despite his efforts to remain calm. "Daddy, you look worried. Are we going to be okay?" "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be fine," Marcus said with as much conviction as he could muster. The pilots are very good at handling situations like this, and airports have special equipment to help airplanes that are having trouble. "We might have a bumpy landing, but we're going to get on the ground safely." The aircraft banked into what Marcus recognized as a standard approach pattern, though the movements felt less precise than normal, confirming his suspicions about compromised control systems. Through Emma's window, he could see an airport in the distance, its runways clearly visible and what appeared to be emergency vehicles already positioned and waiting for their arrival. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our approach to Colorado Springs Airport," the captain announced. "Emergency crews are standing by as a precautionary measure. Please ensure your seatbelts are tight, seat backs upright, and tray tables stowed. Follow all instructions from the flight attendants." The preparation announcement triggered a new wave of anxiety among the passengers. Marcus could hear crying from several sections of the cabin, along with urgent whispered conversations as people called loved ones or prayed quietly. The reality of their situation was becoming undeniable, even to those who had tried to convince themselves that everything was routine. Marcus felt another irregular vibration through the airframe, this one suggesting that the pilots were having difficulty maintaining consistent control inputs. The damaged aircraft was becoming increasingly challenging to fly as they descended toward the airport, requiring constant adjustments to compensate for the loss of engine power and possible hydraulic assistance. "Daddy, I see fire trucks," Emma said, pointing out the window at the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway. Her observation was matter-of-fact rather than frightened, as if she was simply noting an interesting detail rather than recognizing the implications. "Those are there to help us, Marcus explained. Whenever an airplane has any kind of problem, the airport sends out all their safety equipment to make sure everything goes smoothly. It's like having extra helpers waiting to make sure we're okay." The aircraft continued its approach, but Marcus could feel the pilots struggling with the controls as they lined up with the runway. Each course correction seemed to require more effort than it should, and the aircraft's responses appeared delayed and imprecise. These were classic symptoms of degraded flight control systems, making the approach far more challenging than normal procedures. Flight attendant Sarah appeared in their section one final time, checking that all passengers were properly secured for landing. When she reached their row, she paused briefly, her eyes meeting Marcus's with an expression that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of their situation. "Sir, please make sure your daughter is prepared for a potentially rough landing," she said quietly. "Keep her seatbelt tight and be ready to follow evacuation instructions if necessary." Marcus nodded, understanding the subtext of her warning. The crew was preparing for the possibility that their emergency landing might require immediate evacuation procedures, suggesting they were unsure about the aircraft's ability to come to a controlled stop on the runway. The approach to Colorado Springs Airport was becoming increasingly unstable as the aircraft descended through 3,000 feet. Marcus could feel the pilots fighting to maintain control, each course correction requiring more dramatic input than the previous one. The asymmetric thrust and compromised hydraulic systems were creating a perfect storm of handling difficulties that pushed the crew's skills to their absolute limits. Emma had grown quiet beside him, sensing the tension that permeated the cabin despite the crew's efforts to maintain calm. Her small hand gripped his tightly as she watched the ground grow larger through the window, emergency vehicles tracking their approach like mechanical guardians waiting to respond to whatever outcome awaited them. "Daddy, why is the airplane moving so much?" she whispered, noticing the increasingly erratic motion as the pilots struggled with degraded controls. "The pilots are working extra hard to make sure we land safely, sweetheart," Marcus replied softly. "Sometimes when airplanes have problems, they need more attention to fly straight, like trying to ride a bicycle with a flat tire." But even as he comforted Emma, Marcus's trained senses were cataloging every variation in the aircraft's behavior. The hydraulic whining had intensified, suggesting possible total loss of primary flight control assistance. If his assessment was correct, the pilots were likely flying the aircraft using manual reversion, requiring enormous physical effort to manage control inputs. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, triggering screams throughout the cabin as passengers felt the sudden movement. Marcus instinctively tightened his protective grip around Emma while his mind raced through possible scenarios. That particular type of control loss suggested the pilots might be dealing with differential spoiler deployment or asymmetric flap extension, complications that could make landing extremely challenging. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some difficulty with our flight controls," the captain's voice came over the intercom, his professional calm barely masking the strain of their situation. "We are working to resolve these issues and expect to land safely in approximately 5 minutes. Please brace for a potentially hard landing and be prepared to evacuate quickly if instructed." The announcement sent a chill through Marcus's chest. The captain's use of the word evacuate meant the crew was preparing for the possibility of post-landing fire or other hazards that could require immediate passenger evacuation. This was no longer just a precautionary emergency landing, they were dealing with a genuinely life-threatening situation. Around them, passengers were crying openly now, some praying aloud while others sat in stunned silence. Marcus noticed an elderly man across the aisle clutching a photograph, probably of family members he was thinking about in what might be his final moments. The reality of their peril had become impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "Daddy, are we going to die?" Emma asked with the devastating directness that only children possess. Her question cut through all pretense and forced Marcus to confront the possibility he had been trying to avoid acknowledging. "No, baby. We are not going to die," Marcus said firmly, looking directly into her frightened eyes. "The pilots are very skilled, and they know how to handle problems like this. We might have a scary landing, but we are going to walk off this airplane together and give Grandma the biggest hug she's ever had." His words carried a conviction he desperately hoped was justified. The aircraft's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as they descended below 2,000 feet, and Marcus could hear the strain in the engine as the remaining power plant worked beyond normal parameters to maintain sufficient speed and altitude for approach. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to be strong for someone else even when you were terrified yourself? Those moments when you dig deep and find courage you didn't know you possessed, not for yourself but for the people who depend on you? Another violent shudder ran through the aircraft, this one accompanied by a grinding noise that suggested possible landing gear deployment issues. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he recognized the sound pattern that indicated mechanical problems with the gear extension sequence. If they couldn't get the landing gear properly deployed and locked, their emergency landing would become exponentially more dangerous. The aircraft banked sharply to the right, then corrected back to the left in a series of movements that clearly indicated the pilots were fighting to maintain directional control. Through Emma's window, Marcus could see they were now low enough to make out individual emergency vehicles and personnel positioned along the runway. The scale of the emergency response was sobering, with what appeared to be every available piece of firefighting and rescue equipment deployed for their arrival. Flight attendant Sarah appeared one final time, moving through the cabin to ensure all passengers were properly prepared for emergency landing. When she reached their row, her earlier professional demeanor had been replaced by genuine human concern as she knelt beside Emma's seat. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen very carefully to your daddy and do exactly what he tells you when we land, okay?" Sarah said gently to Emma. "You're going to be very brave, just like a superhero." Emma nodded solemnly, and Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward the flight attendant who had moved beyond her earlier dismissiveness to show genuine care for his daughter's well-being. In crisis situations, people often revealed their true character, and Sarah was demonstrating the kind of compassion that made the difference between surviving and thriving. The aircraft shuddered again as the pilots attempted another course correction, and Marcus could feel them descending rapidly now, probably less than 1,000 feet above the airport. The next few minutes would determine whether his assurances to Emma proved true or whether their story would end very differently than either of them had imagined when they boarded the flight in Chicago that morning. The aircraft was now less than 500 feet above the runway, and Marcus could see the desperate situation unfolding in the cockpit through the partially open door as flight attendants prepared for impact. The pilots were physically wrestling with the controls, their bodies straining against the manual effort required to maintain even marginal directional control of the crippled aircraft. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. Rising from his seat despite the violent motion of the aircraft, he moved toward the front of the cabin with the determined stride of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. His years of military training had taught him that sometimes survival depended on stepping beyond the boundaries of normal protocol. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," Sarah called out as she saw him approaching the cockpit area. "We are in final approach and all passengers must be secured." "I understand, but I need to speak to the captain," Marcus replied firmly, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present in his earlier interactions with the crew. "I have extensive flight engineering experience, and I believe I can help with what they're dealing with up there." Sarah moved to block his path, but something in Marcus's demeanor made her pause. Gone was the humble deference of the baggage handler who had politely mentioned engine irregularities earlier in the flight. This was someone who moved with the confidence of professional competence, someone who understood exactly what was happening and knew how to respond. "Ma'am, my call sign is Compass," Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, former Air Force flight engineer with 3 combat tours, Marcus said quietly but urgently. "I've handled emergency situations like this before, and those pilots need all the help they can get right now." The use of his military call sign seemed to cut through Sarah's resistance. She had heard enough emergency radio traffic to recognize the significance of someone identifying themselves with operational credentials rather than civilian titles. Her eyes widened as she realized that the man she had dismissed as an anxious passenger might actually possess the expertise he claimed. Before Sarah could respond, another violent lurch threw both of them against the cabin wall as the aircraft lost directional control momentarily. Through the cockpit door, Marcus could hear the strain in the pilots' voices as they fought to regain stability for their final approach. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional procedures were proving inadequate for the severity of their mechanical failures. "Let him through," came a voice from the cockpit. The captain had heard Marcus's introduction over the intercom system and made the split-second decision that accepting help from a qualified passenger was preferable to continuing to struggle alone with overwhelming control difficulties. Marcus moved quickly toward the cockpit, pausing only to look back at Emma who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay in your seat, baby. Daddy is going to help the pilots, and then we're all going to land safely together." The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos as Marcus stepped inside. Both pilots were drenched in sweat from the physical effort of managing the manual flight controls, their arms straining against the massive forces required to keep the aircraft pointed toward the runway. Warning lights illuminated the instrument panel like a Christmas tree, and the cacophony of audio alerts created an almost overwhelming sensory environment. "What's your assessment?" asked Captain Rodriguez, his voice tight with concentration as he fought to maintain directional control. Marcus quickly scanned the instrument displays, his trained eye immediately identifying the primary issues. "You've lost both primary and backup hydraulic systems, which is why you're fighting the controls so hard. The asymmetric thrust from the dead engine is creating a constant left-turning tendency that's requiring full right rudder to counteract." "Tell us something we don't know," replied the first officer through gritted teeth as he struggled with the control column. "Here's what you might not know," Marcus continued calmly. "With total hydraulic failure, you can use differential thrust and spoiler deployment to help manage directional control. Reduce power on the good engine slightly and use short bursts of increased thrust to help steer rather than fighting it with rudder alone." Captain Rodriguez glanced at Marcus with surprise. The technique he was describing was an advanced emergency procedure that wasn't part of standard commercial pilot training, but it was exactly the kind of unconventional solution that might work in their desperate situation. "That's military transport protocol," the captain said, recognition dawning in his voice. "You really are flight crew." "Was flight crew," Marcus corrected. "But the principles are the same. Your aircraft is essentially a glider with one engine right now, and you need to fly it like one rather than trying to force conventional control inputs." The approach continued with Marcus providing guidance based on his extensive experience with emergency procedures that went far beyond normal commercial aviation protocols. His presence in the cockpit seemed to provide not just technical expertise but also the calm confidence that came from someone who had successfully handled similar crises before. 200 feet, called the first officer as they descended toward the runway threshold. Looking good, Marcus said quietly, monitoring the aircraft's behavior as the pilots implemented his suggestions. Remember, you're going to touch down hard and the aircraft will want to veer left immediately. Be ready with differential braking and don't try to keep it perfectly straight. Just keep it on the pavement. The runway was rushing up to meet them now, emergency vehicles positioned along both sides in preparation for whatever outcome awaited their arrival. The runway threshold rushed toward them at what felt like impossible speed as Marcus stood behind the pilots, his hands gripping the back of the captain's seat while his trained eyes monitored every instrument and control input. The aircraft was descending faster than normal, but that was intentional given their compromised control authority and the need to minimize the time spent fighting unstable flight characteristics. 50 feet, called the first officer, his voice tense with concentration as he prepared for what would likely be the most challenging landing of his career. Power back slightly on the good engine, but keep it spooled up for directional control, Marcus advised calmly. When you touch down, the aircraft is going to want to ground loop to the left. Don't fight it with brakes initially, just use rudder and differential thrust to keep it tracking straight. Captain Rodriguez nodded grimly, his hands white-knuckled on the controls as he prepared for touchdown. Through the windscreen, Marcus could see the emergency vehicles pacing their approach, ready to respond instantly to whatever happened in the next few seconds. 30 feet, the first officer announced. Airspeed 140, slightly fast but controllable. Marcus felt the familiar calm that had always descended on him during critical moments in his military career. This was the convergence of everything he had learned about aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and crisis management. All those years of training and experience had led to this moment when his knowledge could mean the difference between disaster and survival for everyone aboard. 20 feet. 10 feet, the first officer continued his callouts as the runway surface filled their view. The main landing gear touched down with a violent thud that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft structure. Immediately, Marcus felt the predicted left swerve as the asymmetric forces tried to pull the aircraft off the runway centerline. But Captain Rodriguez was ready, implementing the differential thrust technique that Marcus had suggested. Good, Marcus said quietly as the captain fought to maintain directional control. Short burst of power on the good engine. There, perfect. Now let the aircraft decelerate naturally before you start heavy braking. The nose gear slammed down harder than normal, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of tires protesting against the pavement as the pilots worked to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the runway. Emergency vehicles were already racing alongside them, ready to respond if the situation deteriorated further. "We're down and rolling," Captain Rodriguez announced over the intercom, though his battle to control the aircraft was far from over. "Emergency crews are standing by. Please remain seated until we come to a complete stop." The aircraft continued its high-speed roll down the runway, gradually slowing but still requiring constant attention to maintain directional control. Marcus could feel the vibration through the airframe as the damaged systems protested against the stresses of ground operations, but the fundamental structure was holding together. "Excellent work," Marcus said as the aircraft's speed decreased below critical handling thresholds. "You can start applying normal braking now. The worst is behind us." As their speed decreased, Marcus allowed himself to think about Emma for the first time since entering the cockpit. She had watched him leave his seat and disappear into the front of the aircraft during the most terrifying moments of her young life, trusting that her father knew what he was doing even when she couldn't understand why he had left her side. 60 knots and decelerating, the first officer reported. "All systems stable for rollout." Captain Rodriguez began applying steady brake pressure, and Marcus felt the aircraft respond normally as they continued slowing toward taxi speed. The emergency was essentially over now, though procedures would require them to stop on the runway for inspection before proceeding to the gate. "Full stop," Captain Rodriguez announced as the aircraft came to rest on the runway centerline. Around them, emergency vehicles took up positions to conduct safety inspections and ensure no fire hazard existed from the damaged engine. The cockpit fell silent except for the sound of electrical systems and the distant rumble of emergency equipment outside. Both pilots sat back in their seats, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the emergency finally showing as the immediate crisis passed. "I don't know how to thank you," Captain Rodriguez said, turning to face Marcus. "Without your guidance, I'm not sure we could have maintained control for landing. You saved a lot of lives today." Marcus felt a flush of emotion that he quickly pushed aside. "You did the flying, Captain. I just helped with some procedures you probably never hoped you'd need to use." Through the cockpit windows, Marcus could see passengers beginning to move around in the cabin as the reality of their successful landing settled in. Emergency crews were conducting their inspections efficiently, and it appeared that they would be cleared to taxi to the gate once the safety checks were complete. "I need to get back to my daughter," Marcus said, though he remained ready to assist if needed during the taxi process. "Of course," Captain Rodriguez replied. "But I want you to know that I'll be filing a report about your assistance today. This kind of expertise and willingness to help doesn't go unrecognized in our industry." Marcus made his way back through the cabin, noting the expressions of relief and gratitude on passengers' faces as they realized their ordeal was truly over. When he reached row 9, Emma launched herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over. "Daddy, you saved us," she said through tears of relief and pride. "You went up there and helped the pilots fly the airplane." "We all helped each other, sweetheart," Marcus replied, holding her tightly as the weight of what they had just survived began to settle in. "That's what people do when things get scary. We work together to make sure everyone gets home safely." The aircraft sat motionless on the runway for nearly 20 minutes while emergency crews conducted their safety inspections and the pilots worked through post-emergency checklists. Marcus remained in his seat with Emma, answering her stream of questions about what had happened and why he had needed to help the pilots. Her 80-year-old mind was processing the events with the remarkable resilience that children often display in the face of crisis. "Daddy, were you really a pilot in the Army?" Emma asked, her understanding of military branches still developing but her recognition of her father's expertise absolutely clear. "Air Force, sweetheart, and I was a flight engineer, not a pilot," Marcus explained patiently. "Flight engineers know all about how airplanes work and what to do when they have problems. It's like being a doctor for airplanes." The comparison seemed to satisfy Emma's curiosity, and she settled back against his side with the contentment that came from knowing her father was someone special, someone who could help save people when they needed it most. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions as he realized that his carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered in the most public way possible. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom once again, but this time his tone carried warmth and genuine gratitude rather than the professional tension that had characterized his earlier announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been cleared to taxi to the gate. Before we begin moving, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who made our safe landing possible today." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he realized what was coming. He had hoped to slip back into anonymity once the emergency was over, to return to being just another passenger who happened to have been in the right place at the right time. But he should have known that his intervention wouldn't go unnoticed or unacknowledged. Passenger Marcus Chen in Seat 9A is a former Air Force flight engineer who provided crucial technical assistance during our emergency, Captain Rodriguez continued. "His expertise and willingness to step forward when we needed help most likely saved all our lives today. I want everyone on this aircraft to know that we owe our safe arrival to his knowledge and courage." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause that started somewhere in the front and quickly spread throughout the aircraft. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and emotion as passengers turned to look at him with expressions of gratitude and admiration. Several people were openly crying, and he heard someone call out, "Thank you," from across the aisle. Emma beamed with pride beside him, clapping enthusiastically and looking around to make sure everyone knew that the hero they were applauding was her daddy. Her joy was infectious and pure, unmarred by any understanding of the broader implications of what had just happened to their quiet, invisible life. Flight attendant Sarah appeared at their row, her earlier condescension completely replaced by genuine respect and gratitude. She knelt in the aisle beside Marcus's seat, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she struggled to find adequate words for what she wanted to express. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I dismissed you earlier when you tried to help, and I was completely wrong. You saved all of us today, and I'm ashamed that I judged you based on your uniform rather than listening to what you were trying to tell us." "You don't need to apologize," Marcus replied gently. "You were doing your job and following protocols. None of us expected to be dealing with an emergency like this." But Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, what I did was wrong. I made assumptions about who you were and what you knew based on how you looked and where you worked. That's not acceptable, and it could have cost lives today if you hadn't been persistent enough to step forward when it really mattered." The aircraft began moving slowly toward the gate, the taxi process now routine after the drama of their emergency landing. Marcus could see ground crews and emergency vehicles following their progress, ensuring that any residual safety concerns were addressed before passengers were allowed to disembark. As they approached the terminal, Marcus found himself thinking about what would happen next. The quiet anonymity that had defined his life since leaving the military was over. There would be reports to file, interviews to give, and probably media attention that he neither wanted nor felt prepared to handle. His simple existence as a ground crew worker was about to become much more complicated. "Daddy, are people going to want to talk to you about what happened?" Emma asked with the perceptive awareness that children often display about adult situations they don't fully understand. "Probably, sweetheart," Marcus admitted. "When something like this happens, people want to know how it worked out and who helped make it better. But we'll handle it together, okay? Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out as a team." The aircraft reached the gate and came to a final stop, the familiar sounds of ground equipment being connected providing a comforting return to normal operations. Through the windows, Marcus could see airport personnel and what appeared to be media representatives gathering near the gate area, confirming his suspicions about the attention their emergency landing would attract. What would you do if you suddenly found yourself thrust into the spotlight after years of living quietly in the background? Sometimes life forces us to step into roles we never expected, revealing strengths and capabilities we had forgotten we possessed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Colorado Springs," Captain Rodriguez announced. "We will be deplaning shortly. Emergency personnel will be conducting brief interviews with some passengers as part of standard post-incident procedures. Thank you all for your cooperation during our emergency, and special thanks again to Marcus Chen for his invaluable assistance." As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Marcus realized that his life had fundamentally changed in the span of a few hours. The man who had boarded the aircraft as an invisible airport worker was about to step off as someone whose expertise and courage had been publicly recognized and celebrated. Emma squeezed his hand tightly as they prepared to leave their seats. "I'm proud of you, Daddy. You're a hero." Marcus looked down at his daughter's shining face and felt a complex mixture of pride, gratitude, and uncertainty about what the future would hold for both of them. The moment Marcus and Emma stepped off the aircraft into the jet bridge, they were greeted by a small crowd of airport officials, airline representatives, and what appeared to be local media personnel. The quiet arrival Marcus had expected for their visit to Emma's grandmother had transformed into something resembling a press conference, complete with cameras and reporters eager to document the story of the emergency landing. "Mr. Chen, I'm Janet Williams, the airport operations manager," said a professional woman in a navy suit who approached them first. "Could we speak with you privately for a few minutes about what happened during the flight? We need to conduct a standard debriefing as part of our emergency response protocols." Marcus felt Emma's hand tighten in his as she processed the unusual attention they were receiving. Her 80-year-old mind understood that something significant had happened, but the full implications of her father's newfound recognition were still beyond her comprehension. "Of course, but I'd prefer to keep my daughter with me if that's acceptable," Marcus replied, his protective instincts heightened by the unfamiliar environment of official scrutiny and media attention. "Absolutely," Janet assured him. "We can use the VIP lounge for privacy. This won't take long, and then you'll be free to continue with your travel plans." As they walked through the terminal, Marcus noticed passengers from their flight pointing him out to family members who had come to meet them. Word was spreading quickly about the dramatic emergency landing and the passenger who had helped save the day. Several people approached to thank him personally, their gratitude genuine and deeply moving. "Daddy, why is everyone taking pictures?" Emma whispered as they passed a group of travelers who were clearly documenting their presence with cell phone cameras. "People are interested in what happened on our airplane, sweetheart," Marcus explained quietly. "Sometimes when something unusual occurs, people want to remember it and share the story with others." The VIP lounge provided a welcome respite from the growing attention in the main terminal. Janet Williams was joined by Captain Rodriguez, who had completed his own post-flight procedures and specifically requested to participate in Marcus's debriefing. The captain's presence lent additional weight to the formal recognition of Marcus's crucial contribution to their survival. "Mr. Chen, I want to start by saying that what you did today goes far beyond normal passenger assistance," Captain Rodriguez began, his tone carrying the gravity of someone who understood exactly how close they had come to disaster. "Your technical knowledge and willingness to act under pressure were absolutely essential to our successful emergency landing." The debriefing proceeded methodically as Marcus recounted his observations of the developing mechanical problems, his attempts to alert the crew, and his eventual decision to offer direct assistance in the cockpit. Janet Williams took detailed notes while Captain Rodriguez provided professional context about the severity of the emergency and the effectiveness of Marcus's recommendations. "The techniques you suggested aren't part of standard commercial pilot training," Captain Rodriguez explained. "The differential thrust method for directional control during hydraulic failure is primarily military doctrine. Without that knowledge, we would have been fighting a losing battle with conventional control inputs." Emma listened quietly to the adult conversation, her young mind processing the technical details she didn't understand but clearly recognizing the respect and gratitude in the voices of the people talking to her father. Her pride in Marcus was evident in her posture and the way she stayed close to his side throughout the interview. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask about your background," Janet Williams said, consulting her notes. "Captain Rodriguez mentioned that you identified yourself using military call signs and demonstrated expertise that suggests extensive aviation experience." Marcus provided a brief summary of his Air Force career, his specialization in flight engineering, and the circumstances that led to his medical discharge and current employment as ground crew. As he spoke, he could see the growing understanding in both officials' expressions about the remarkable coincidence that had placed someone with his specific expertise aboard their troubled aircraft. "This is extraordinary," Janet Williams said after Marcus finished his explanation. "The statistical probability of having a qualified flight engineer aboard during this type of emergency is virtually zero. You being on that flight today undoubtedly saved lives." The interview continued for another 20 minutes as officials documented every aspect of Marcus's involvement for their formal incident report. Captain Rodriguez made it clear that he would be recommending Marcus for recognition from both the airline and aviation safety organizations, emphasizing that his actions represented the highest standards of aviation professionalism and civilian heroism. "Daddy, are we still going to see Grandma?" Emma asked during a brief break in the questioning, her practical 80-year-old concerns cutting through the formal proceedings with refreshing directness. "Yes, sweetheart, we're definitely still going to see Grandma," Marcus assured her. "All of this will be finished soon, and then we'll take another airplane to Denver just like we planned." "Will that airplane be broken too?" Emma asked with the logical follow-up question that made all the adults in the room smile despite the seriousness of their discussion. "No, baby, that airplane will be perfectly fine," Marcus replied, pulling her closer. "What happened today was very unusual. Most airplanes never have problems like ours did." As the debriefing concluded, Janet Williams presented Marcus with official documentation recognizing his assistance during the emergency. The certificate was formal and impressive, but Marcus found himself more moved by the simple thank you note that Emma had written on VIP lounge stationery while the adults talked, decorating it with crayon drawings of airplanes and hearts. "Mr. Chen, there are several reporters outside who would like to speak with you about what happened," Janet Williams mentioned as they prepared to leave the lounge. "Participation is entirely voluntary, but the story of your heroism is already spreading, and they're hoping for a brief interview." Marcus looked down at Emma, considering whether subjecting her to media attention was appropriate given her age and the stress she had already endured. The decision about how to handle their newfound visibility would be the first of many choices that would shape their lives in the aftermath of this extraordinary day. Marcus decided to speak briefly with the media, understanding that his story would be told with or without his participation, and preferring to ensure accuracy rather than speculation. Emma stood beside him during the impromptu press conference, her small hand in his as cameras captured the moment that would transform their quiet lives forever. "I just did what anyone with my training would have done," Marcus said in response to questions about his heroism. The real heroes were Captain Rodriguez and his crew, who maintained control of the aircraft under impossible conditions. "I simply provided some technical suggestions based on my military experience." The reporters pressed for more details about his background and current employment, clearly fascinated by the contrast between his humble airport job and his extraordinary aviation expertise. Marcus answered their questions with the same patient dignity he brought to every aspect of his life, neither minimizing his contribution nor claiming more credit than he deserved. "Will this change your career plans?" asked one reporter, a question that Marcus hadn't yet fully considered himself. "Right now, I'm focused on getting my daughter safely to her grandmother's house," Marcus replied diplomatically. "Everything else can wait until we've completed our trip and had time to process what happened today." But even as he spoke, Marcus could see airport officials and airline representatives exchanging meaningful glances. The formal recognition ceremonies and media attention were just the beginning of the opportunities that would likely emerge from his public demonstration of expertise and character under pressure. The connecting flight to Denver proceeded without incident, though Marcus and Emma found themselves upgraded to first class and treated with the kind of attention typically reserved for celebrities. Fellow passengers recognized them from news reports that had already begun circulating, and flight attendants made special efforts to ensure their comfort during the short journey. Emma's grandmother was waiting at the Denver gate with tears in her eyes and arms outstretched for the reunion she had feared might never happen. The elderly woman embraced both Marcus and Emma with the fierce gratitude of someone who understood how close she had come to losing the two people who meant everything to her. "I saw the news reports," she whispered to Marcus as she held him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, and so grateful that you were able to bring my grandbaby home safely." The remainder of their visit to Denver was punctuated by phone calls from aviation industry representatives, job offers from airlines and aerospace companies, and interview requests from national media outlets. Marcus found himself fielding opportunities that would have seemed impossible just days earlier, when his greatest career aspiration was steady employment that allowed him to provide for Emma. "Daddy, are you going to be famous now?" Emma asked one evening as they sat on her grandmother's porch, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I don't know about famous, sweetheart," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "But it seems like people have noticed that Daddy knows something about airplanes, and they might want him to use that knowledge to help keep other people safe." Emma considered this with the serious contemplation that characterized her approach to important questions. "Would that make you happy, Daddy? To help people with airplanes again?" The innocent question cut straight to the heart of what Marcus had been struggling to understand about his own feelings. For years, he had convinced himself that his aviation career was behind him, that his identity as a flight engineer was buried along with his military service. But the emergency had awakened something in him that he had tried to ignore, a sense of purpose and capability that transcended his physical limitations. "Yes, I think it would make me very happy," Marcus admitted, perhaps to himself as much as to his daughter. Over the following weeks, as they returned to Chicago and resumed their normal routines, the opportunities continued to materialize. Airlines offered consulting positions that would utilize Marcus's expertise while accommodating his need to maintain stability for Emma. Aerospace companies proposed training roles that would allow him to pass his knowledge to the next generation of aviation professionals. The job at the airport, which had once represented the limits of his post-military possibilities, became a stepping stone to opportunities he had never dared to imagine. His supervisors, who had known him only as a reliable baggage handler, suddenly understood that they had been employing someone whose knowledge and experience far exceeded his job description. "Marcus, we've had calls from 3 different airlines asking about hiring you as a consultant," his supervisor explained during what had become a routine conversation about his evolving career prospects. I hate to lose you from the ground crew, but it seems like you're destined for bigger things. If this story has touched your heart today, we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Whether you're in a small town or a big city, whether it's morning or evening where you are, your connection to these moments of human courage and redemption reminds us that extraordinary people are everywhere, often hidden in plain sight. Please subscribe and share this story if it moved you, because sometimes we all need reminders that heroes walk among us every day. Emma adapted to their changing circumstances with the resilience that had carried her through every challenge in her young life. She understood that her father was special, that his knowledge and courage had saved people, and that their future was brighter because he had been willing to step forward when others needed him most. 6 months after the emergency landing, Marcus accepted a position as a senior aviation safety consultant, a role that utilized his technical expertise while providing the financial stability and professional recognition that had seemed impossible during his years of quiet anonymity. The transformation was complete, but the man remained fundamentally unchanged, still Emma's devoted father, still humble about his abilities, still ready to help others when circumstances demanded it. The single dad who had been nobody in Row 9 had become someone whose expertise and character were recognized throughout the aviation industry, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple willingness to step forward when others need help, even when the world has told you that you're invisible.